So we're about to get started. I want to welcome all of our audience members, our family members, our families in the audience, and all of our virtual audience members as well on YouTube. It will be recorded, so if you want to watch it later or recommend it to others, it'll be on the Clark County channel. I'm Mary Catherine Hawks, and I am one of the trauma specialists for the district, and I'm going to be supporting and facilitating the panel today on behalf of our Department of Family and Community Engagement. But our Department of Family and Student Support Services is the larger department that is helping put this on today, and we have several of our staff here as well. So we're so grateful you're here, and really today's session is just going to focus on the expertise of our panelists. So I'm going to spend the time introducing our panelists and then let us jump right into questions for them. So I'll turn off my music. So these are our panelists, and I'm going to read a short bio of our panelists. Sorry, my mic. And then we're going to just jump right into our questions. So our first panelist we have today is Dr. Rodney Swanson. And Dr. Swanson is the hearing officer for the Clark County School District. He has been in education for more than 30 years, and he is married with 2 sons, and he enjoys reading, music, traveling, and exercising. Then we have Miss Bogla, Jody Bogla. She's originally from Augusta, Georgia. She has taught for 25 years. 22 of those are in Clark County at Clark Central High School. She teaches English to English language learners, everything from beginning English to lit comp. She shares what I like most about restorative practices is that they not only build a positive school culture, but also teach how to resolve conflict in sustainable ways, skills we use even outside of school. And then we have Mr. Jabari Cobb, and we have a bit of a longer introduction for him because he is our new Director of School Support Services. So he's actually going to be very instrumental in this work, but I do want to say he started on Thursday, so we're so grateful that he is on our panel, even having just jumped into our Clark County family. And he has over 20 years of experience serving in education. He served as a paraprofessional, a teacher, a coach, an administrator, a district-level personnel, and currently, he is our new Director of School Support Services. And he is actually the overseer of our hearing officer, Dr. Swanson, and myself and Karen, who's here supporting, who are our trauma specialists. And he also has worked with EL students, exceptional education, general education, career technical education settings, and he's worked in the centers, and in traditional campuses. He has worked with students and parents in elementary school, middle school, high school. He's native of Georgia. He was born in Atlanta and raised in Decatur. And he graduated from Morehouse College in Atlanta with his bachelor's degree in English. Then he completed his master's and specialist degrees in educational leadership from Mercer University. And then finally, we have Mr. Danny Malik, who is the executive director at the Georgia Conflict Center, whose mission is to build peace with justice by advancing restorative practices in communities, schools, and institutions in Athens and beyond. GCC has been supporting whole school restorative practices implementation at 3 Clark County schools since 2018, and he has served as assistant principal for restorative practices at E.L. Hayes Public Charter School in Washington, D.C. from 2012 to 2016. So thank you to all of our panelists and to all of our families who are here tonight watching. All right. If you are watching virtually, or even if you're here in person and you have your smartphone, you can catch this QR code to ask some questions virtually. And or we'll also have a time to pass around a mic as time allows at the end of the session. So we have some pre-prepared questions, but then we'll also have some time for audience questions at the end to make sure we're still done by 7 p.m. Any questions about how that goes since we have a small crowd? Anything we need? Okay. And then I'm going to, just for the people in the audience, introduce, I noticed Dr. Scott, our Director of Family and Student Support Services, is also here tonight, so thank you, Dr. Scott. Sorry to put you on the spot. I didn't tell her I was going to do that. All right, so we're just going to jump right into our first question. And for this first question, we're going to ask and start with Danny, and then we'll allow the other panelists to answer as they would like as well. So Danny, this first question is, for those who are new to the restorative practices idea, can you share the ways that you would describe the concept to somebody who's new?
Sure. Well, I describe restorative practices as a way of being and an approach more than, say, a curriculum or a program, a way of being or approach that is principle-based. It's guided by a set of principles that prioritize community, connection, relationships, prioritize democratic participation, and then, of course, how we often think about restorative practices or restorative justice, responding to harm in ways that embrace relationships, inclusiveness, support, and accountability. So it's you know, at its core, it's about relationships and how do we think about building positive, pro-social relationships with students and colleagues throughout, you know, the school day and the school community, and then how do we respond to harm, knowing that harm has a ripple effect and wrongdoing and things like that have a ripple effect throughout the school community. How do we respond to ways that meet the needs of those who have been impacted and work together to make things better?
Thank you so much, Danny. Would anybody else on the panel like to add to Danny's perspective? I've been told in education there's a pause and you're supposed to count, so I'm giving adequate time. Okay. All right, so we'll move on to our next question. And this one's a bit more longer. And this is that restorative practices can be used across many aspects of society, including but not limited to schools. So I'd like for y'all to share a concrete example of a restorative practice implemented in your personal experiences or work. And we'll start here with Jabari.
Sure, thank you, and thank you for the invite. I would have to harken back to, well, one, I just want to say this. When you look at the last several weeks that we've been enthralled in politics, you know, you look at even families, let me just say this, being transparent, my wife and I, we have different political views, you know, and that can have people who share a community sometimes being at opposite ends of different topics. And so when I think about restorative practice in society, I think this is a great opportunity for all of us to embrace the concept of restored relationships, because regardless of who won, who lost, or who's in a runoff, we still share the same community, and we don't want things to divide us from moving efficiently. So I think schools is a great place to start that process, because we're going to share buses, we're going to share cafeterias, we share classrooms, but we don't always share the same ideas, and we should formalize that. So I like the concept of a culture. I think that's what we're embracing here in Clark County, is a restorative culture. With that being said, a specific example, having served as an administrator and hearing officer, a lot of times one thing about restorative practice is that something has to happen usually to bring us to the table. I think about restorative practices in regard of a house. You know, you restore a home, you don't throw the home away, but you want to restore it to a point where you can still use it. In this particular instance, there was an administrator that brought a student to me for decision-making processes. As I heard the offense that the administrator was bringing, I began to hear, I'm also a mediator, so you kind of have to hear what they're not saying and what they are saying. And it sounded as if there was a relationship between the student and the administrator, the student administrator, that had been broken by the offense. And because a parent was there, the parent also vocalized how disappointed she was in the administrative response. So you're hearing the offense, which has to be dealt with. So I always want to state, restorative practices does not take away the consequence. But then we deal with what happens next. And so I asked all parties, would they be open to a restorative opportunity? Because to hear an administrator talk about a student's behavior and how it disappointed them, and hear the student say, well, I thought you would have given this to me, and then the parent, who's also part of this process, instead of just doling out what I would normally have done, and I'll be the first to say, you know, as administrator, I'm used to doling out consequences, but I thought it was important to offer the opportunity to restore a relationship that would eventually come back anyway, because she's going to come back to the classroom. She's going to be back in the school, and the parent has to still be able to trust you with their child as well.
Yeah.
And that's I was speaking to my colleague here, that was kind of my intro into restorative practices, because at that point, I was just a guy who knew the code of conduct.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jabari. I really appreciate that answer. And Dr. Swanson, would you have anything you'd like to add to that question?
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Hawk. As a principal for 10 years, it was important for me to be able to grow my students and to grow my faculty and staff. So when you talk about restorative practices, because people are going to make mistakes, and so as individuals make mistakes, they have to trust us enough to understand that we're there to help them and support them through that process. And so when students get in trouble, we provide consequences, right? And so with those consequences, we also need to provide them with an opportunity to understand that there are high expectations, there is a consequence, but after the consequence, we still want to assist you in the growth academically, socially, athletically. So we want to make sure that we restore individuals. And one thing that comes to mind, I don't know if you guys have ever seen the show Roots, but they had manhood training. Kunta Kinte had manhood training when he was young, going from a young man to a man. And one of the lessons that they taught them is if you capture someone from a neighboring tribe, what do? And they say you open up the door for them to leave and get back to their families. And so instead of punishing them with death, you give them an opportunity to grow as individuals, and then they come back and allow you to grow as an individual because you've built that trust.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swanson. I'm going to allow anyone else on the panel to add anything to this question y'all would like.
Can I just mention one other thing that's happening in Athens in this way
Absolutely.
that I'm excited about? Tomorrow, I think it is, we're formalizing a partnership, Georgia Conflict Center, with the District Attorney's Office to offer restorative justice conferencing as a diversion in the juvenile justice system. So in terms of other applications in the society, that's going to be, the district attorney's office will be able to make referrals, and youth, as well as people that they have caused harm to, will come together to talk about the impact of that and come up with a plan for repairing that harm. And as long as the youth follows through on the things they commit to doing, then those charges will be dismissed. There's no probation or parole. And that type of program has had very positive outcomes around the country. So we're excited that we're going to be beginning that within days here in Athens as well.
Thank you, Danny. So for our next question, we're digging a little deeper into Clark County schools. I want some of y'all that have been in our schools implementing, one-on-one with students, these restorative practices. Can you share a way that you've done that and that you've implemented restorative practices, whether it was your classroom or on the larger school setting? And we'll start this question with Jody.
Hi, thank you. When I thought about this question, I think of three things. And the first is the point of view from me as a teacher. The first is my first experience with restorative practices, which was 4 years ago. And I know that because the student that I was having issues with was a ninth grader, and now she's a senior, and we have a pretty good relationship. And I don't think that would have happened if we hadn't had restorative practices at the time. And so this kind of touches on what Mr. Cobb said about this, and also Dr. Swanson. These students are with us, and the point is to keep them with us. So I had an experience in 4 years ago with a student that wasn't following the class rules, was disruptive, and instead of just, continuously calling home or writing the student up, I don't know if that's going to help solve the problem completely, because a student doesn't reach ninth grade and all of a sudden start to disrupt class. Oftentimes these students have, been tardy before or talked back before or gotten out of their seat without permission before. So we did the restorative practice, and I think one of the best things about it was that there was a method to it. It was a structure that we could follow. So we really, truly were, even though there was a power difference, right? I'm the teacher, and this student is, 14 years old. But because we were in the equity circle and we followed a method that Mr. Melick led, we had that scaffold that made it, it invited us all to speak. And I learned a lot about this student that I don't think she would have shared with me otherwise, so that I could understand where she was coming from, and she could understand where I was coming from. And I'm not saying that it was a fix, but when she did behaviors, I stopped and I thought about it. And I could ask her, like, I didn't have to accept those behaviors, but we could have, there would be consequences, but we could have a conversation. So as a teacher, in that kind of small area, that's how I use restorative practices. And then I don't want to take up too much more time, but we use it around the school for conflict resolution, and I can hear students, I can see them going to the restorative practices room for, for a circle. I've heard about students talking about the circle, so it's starting to really be a part of our community, which I think is really important because it is giving students a voice, and it's letting them think that they're, letting them know that they're being heard. And I think it's good for the culture of the school. And so then the final thing is that every Wednesday in advisement, we do a circle. So the process is really embedded. And again, I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning. It gives students a structure for communicating.
And I'm going to ask a quick follow-up. You said you've heard students talking about it, and you can feel free to pass since this is not a question you're prepared for, but what are some of the things they've said when you've heard them speaking?
Well, I'll see, they'll say in a funny way, if they see students having a conflict, I'll hear somebody in the hall say, "You need a restorative circle." And that's the funniest one. But I think that's where I hear it the most. But then I overhear maybe a teacher saying that students are in the circle today, or just things like that, not really making a comment about it, but just knowing that it's there, right? That it's a part of what we do at Clark Central.
Thank you so much, Jody. And then, Danny, would you like to add anything to that question or add an experience of yours?
Yeah, I guess just building on what Jody said, that in the schools that we've been, these pilot schools here in Clark County, Clark Central, Clark Middle, and Whit Davis, that circle process is kind of a foundational piece there, teaching that and having that structure as a space for dialogue, a space to get to know each other. But also, then when there are challenges, could be disciplinary or other, then we have that structure that everybody already understands how it works. They understand what are the values, and so that seeing that structure being used in the face of conflict and in disciplinary situations is been powerful to see as well. From the elementary, the very little ones, they have the capacity to work through problems and solve problems together in a way that similarly our high schoolers and even oftentimes us as adults have really kind of suppressed those skills. We're not used to having to talk out problems. And so we use them with adults as well in those skills, in those schools. And so, that's kind of in the responsive way. But I think, similar to Jody, other teachers have talked about, before they did this work, they did a lot of write-ups, and they saw little change. After being trained in restorative practices, now they choose rather to have a conversation with the students, and they see things change much more quickly through having restorative conversations rather than just writing folks up and going that route. So I'll just put that up.
Thank you so much, Danny. So for this next question, Danny's already touched on it a bit, but I'm going to see if you want to add and or if you would like to add to what you already shared or add any other initiatives. And this is around how there's restorative practices being implemented in our broader community in Athens, Clark County. So if you want to expand on the example you already used or on others, that would be great.
I'm sorry, I guess I
I know we had
went ahead on that one.
That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably one of the most concrete ones is the restorative justice conferencing being used. But really, that it becomes kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of the community. What I know the DA Gonzalez has a vision for being able to have a space, a place where anybody from the community can come if you have conflict, or it could be, even a domestic violence type situation, and you'd rather resolve it in a way that brings folks together to work together to solve it. She has a vision to have a space like that in Athens. There's a similar model in Savannah, actually, and we've gone down and visited. And so, once we start to put out that that the community wants to bring community together to solve their own problems and not rely on others to do that, there's many applications for that in the community. The first one being this diversion program in the juvenile justice system. But from there, there's lots of possibilities.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Danny.
you.
Would anybody else like to share an example, or maybe from their communities if you've been in another community for a bit longer? And I will take a brief moment just to introduce Dr. Tolbert, and we're so grateful she's here. Dr. Tolbert has a very rich experiences in restorative practices. I believe she wrote her dissertation on it, so she's a wealth of knowledge. Am I misrepresenting that? Okay, I'm misrepresenting that. I'm so sorry. But she's our assistant principal from Cedar Shoals. So welcome, Dr. Tolbert. And did anybody want to add anything to that question about restorative practices in our broader community of Athens? Okay. All right. So for these next questions, they're going to be around some more barriers, accountability and success around restorative practices. And this first question is, can you share some of the biggest challenges to implementing restorative practices? And we'll start with Dr. Swanson.
So as the hearing officer here in the district, I think one of the biggest challenges in implementing restorative practices is making sure everyone's on the same page and they understand the purpose of it. Because you have some individuals who want to write a student up on the first offense, and we know restorative practices allows for progressive discipline. And so we want to make sure that we get everybody on the same page. So in terms of change, when individuals are just used to punishing a student, having to think through a process where it's progressive and allowing the student to make more mistakes as it goes deeper into the discipline process, or not make mistakes at all, or make that one mistake and get into the restorative circle and figure out what they need to do in order to avoid getting in further trouble. So I think one of the biggest challenges is just getting everybody on the same page.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swanson. Would anybody else on the panel like to add anything?
I'll take a moment and add to that. I think one of the larger challenges that we have faced within our district is almost what Dr. Swanson just mentioned, which is getting everyone to understand that it's a mindset shift. Mm-hmm. It's not something that you necessarily, that's just pure from the beginning. So you have to train people and implement those strategies, and understanding that it's a culture and not just something 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like, it's a part of what we do. It's embedded in the work that we're doing. Additionally, it's also understanding that although we have restorative practices, there are still consequences for behaviors at times. So yes, we want to give you an opportunity to restore or fix what it is that you've done wrong. However, we also want to hold you accountable in some other ways. And it doesn't necessarily mean suspension or any of those things, but definitely having them understand the difference between, the circles and consequences, and then just understanding that it's embedded. It's a way of doing things that's embedded in what we do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tolbert. And I'm going to offer the rest of the panelists a moment to share anything.
Well, I would offer, I guess, in addition to what you mentioned, I'm sorry, Dr. Tolbert mentioned, is that restorative practice is a consequence. I know as a parent and a former administrator, a consequence, it's not always negative. but allowing you to face the person that you may have victimized, and that offense is a consequence as well. It also gives voice to the person who may have been victimized. But hopefully, and I'm sure all these individuals will agree, we want to provide a level of empathy that you can acquire as the alleged offender, so that hopefully you won't do it again. If I have to face you now, and you don't force me, but you allow me to see how I may have done harm to you, and you restore it, hopefully when I see you again in the hallway, in the locker room, wherever it's going to be, that I'll remember that the consequence was not going home. Well, potentially, maybe it was, but maybe when I came back, I still had to see the person that I may have offended, and that is also a consequence.
Thank you so much, Jabari. All right, and I apologize. I think the last time I forgot to switch the slide, or maybe I missed a question. So we're moving on to the next question, if you saw my slides switched. And this next question is, how do you think that families can use and reinforce the principles of restorative practices in their homes? And we can start with Jabari on this one as well.
Again, and that's, family engagement is also a passion of mine. I think that, again, it goes back to the word culture. Effective schools outline their curriculum, and they share with the parents reinforce the curriculum. We learn algebra that way, and we go home, kids go home with it and reinforce it at home. But we look at any academic subject, that's what we do. We teach, and then we ask you to reinforce at home. If you're in the band, if you're in sports, we do the same thing. We get the plays, we get the music, we teach, but we don't always take restorative practices and relationship building and do that at school, because we don't have it embedded in our culture. And so there's conflict at school that I can't deal with, and then even at home, there's conflict I can't deal with. So when do we teach, when do we have it embedded in our culture so that both the community and the school is on the same page? There's conflict at home. And in many cases, parents, because they're authoritative in their role, usually just give a consequence. You do because I say so. And so there's no voice. But if we give parents the opportunity to allow their kids to have voices at home, they can have voices at school as well, an appropriate voice, but a voice nonetheless. So I think that's, but parents have to be taught, like we ask them to reinforce the math skills, we now give you skills at home that you can also, because they're in school theoretically 8 hours a day. That's, 40 hours a week. But they're at home or in the community the other 16 hours a day, plus weekend. So they have more time to either have what we teach them be reinforced, or more time to have it contradicted and disregarded. So I think it's important that we teach families how to teach kids, like any other subject area that we have in our schools, in our community.
Thank you so much, Jabari. Would you like to add anything, Dr. Swanson, to that answer?
Yes, ma'am. First, I'd like to say it's not easy being a parent. My wife and I raised two young men. They're 25 and 27, and it takes work. And so, as Mr. Cobb said, you're working all day, you come home, your kids are in trouble, and the first thing you want to do is tell them and be that authoritarian figure and give them a consequence, right? But I think it's important for families to understand, number one, it's difficult. Number two, make sure you have high expectations for your children. I did tell my students, I told my children, your job is to make my life easier, right? And from the jump, that's what they understood. So your job is to make your mom's life and my life easier. So make sure you take care of the things that you're supposed to take care of. And as they get into trouble, then of course we want to sit and listen, understand what's going on, and what's the best route to make sure we remedy that and not have it be allowed again within the structure of the family. So just making sure that parents take the time, because it's difficult after 8 hours of work every day and coming home and having to spend time with your children, but just make sure they have an opportunity to share with the parents what's going on and then having a process for that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swanson. And Jody, having implemented these practices in your classroom, would you have any advice for families on how they can replicate that in their homes?
Yeah, I had talked to Mr. Melick about this, and this idea of inviting young people into the conversation so that the parent isn't, I know the parent is the dominant figure, but kind of like supporting this idea of having a two-way communication, like true communication with with students, because we're building young people, right, to have skills to communicate outside, in all kinds of different arenas, and to say, okay, well, you want them to communicate well away from home, so bring it into the home too, and this is the way that we can do it.
Thank you so much, Jody. Dr. Tolbert or Danny, would y'all like to add anything to that question?
I would just say, I see home sometimes as being a classroom as well. So the same way that we expect teachers to build a classroom that's conducive to learning, we have to expect parents to build a home that's conducive to discipline. And that's good discipline, of course. I would like to think I'm a good disciplinarian at home most times. But we build a plan and then we give strategies, and we expect for teachers and parents, or teachers and students to actually go back and practice those things. Sometimes it takes building a plan at home, practicing those skills, communication skills, follow through, accountability, all of those things, and then holding the families accountable for those by practicing and making sure that they're consistent, firm, fair, and consistent is what I would say. So that could be a way of using it at home, as opposed to corporal punishment and other things.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tolbert. Danny, since I gave you the opportunity to, do you want to add anything?
Just to say, I think that a restorative approach for me as a parent has given me, it's taken some pressure off of parenting and acting as if I'm supposed to have all the answers all the time. Given this is a relationally based approach, when things happen, I have a senior and I have a sixth grader. When things happen, get the brain going towards the restorative questions rather than what I was trained at growing up. The restorative questions, first thing I get to do is ask, what happened? Tell me what, were their parents there? Were there not? What was going on? So what happened? The restorative questions are the same in almost any situation. What happened? Who was impacted by this? Who was affected? Tell me. Was anybody hurt? Did anybody have to go to the hospital? What happened? Who's been affected? And then what are we going to do now to make this right? Do we need to go over and apologize to those parents? But really setting my sons, in this case, up for the opportunity to problem solve on their own, because one of mine, I'm going to be off on his own next year. And if I don't build those skills now, who knows? I think the problems could be more severe. So for me, it takes some pressure off and just rely on the questions and allow those questions to create space for us to have compassion, but also accountability.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you to all our panelists for giving those perspectives to our families. This is a time where I can echo something I think Dr. Swanson said, humans make mistakes, so I did mess up our slides. So I'm going to skip forward 2 questions, so thank you to our panelists for bearing with me. I skipped a question and asked a question before I put it on the screen, but for anybody confused online, I apologize. So we can get some restoration around that and move on to the next question, which I think now we're on track. And this question is, one of the arguments against restorative practices can be the mention of decreased accountability. Many of y'all have already mentioned maybe people feel it reduces consequences. So some of y'all have spoken to this already, but if we can add to what's already been said, from your perspective, how would you respond to those who cite this as a barrier? And I'm going to start with Danny for this one, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think the question is interesting because one of the core principles of restorative practices is accountability. And in all that we're doing with this work, we're working to build responsibility, ownership, accountability, and recognizing that our actions have an impact far beyond just ourselves, and trying to understand, build empathy to what those impacts are, and really understanding that. So I decreased accountability. I don't see it. I never have in this work, because that's the core of what this work is accountability.
So it sounds like what I'm hearing is that people that ask that maybe need more education around what restorative practices are.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to add to it. I like this question because I've been asked this question before. A few weeks ago, we had an event at Clark Central High School, and a parent was concerned about this. And I just wanted to reiterate what Mr. Cobb said, that, and what Danny said about this being a part of the accountability, that you have to stay and do the circle. But the accountability doesn't have to be something negative, right? And we all know that, right? That's the foundation for what's happening. But this brings things full circle, right? It makes a complete accountability, and rather than just one part, like a small part of accountability, then it makes it a fuller process.
Thank you so much, Jody. Would anybody else on the panel like to add?
Yeah, most certainly. I would definitely have to agree with my colleagues, and certainly Danny. I think when you think about restorative practices, one of the additional, and by the way, I used to be a skeptic, so let me say this again, for administrator, I know the code of conduct, but I think that one thing I have learned that it gives is voices, not only to the person who has to dole through the consequence of the offense, but even the victim, the alleged victim. Because many times, and Dr. Swanson, I'm sure, can attest this as administrator, something happens, we suspend, you go home, and then you just kind of come back to the environment. But the person has a choice to be heard that was offended, and you get a chance to hear what you did, how it affected me. And so you're held accountable not only for perhaps the consequence via the code of conduct, but you're also held accountable to now face to hear what you have done and how it has affected me as a person. And I think the whole point of discipline is to change behavior. But if I just keep giving suspensions, in some cases, depending on the student, you're rewarding behavior. I don't be here anyway. But if I can convince you that there's a human behind that behavior and that consequence, then hopefully that would deter the other time. So I love the voice that it gives to all parties involved. You hear how it affects the classroom teacher of the school, you hear how it affects the alleged victim, and you get a chance to speak as well. It won't change my consequence, but hopefully it'll change your behavior in the future.
Thank you, Jabari. Dr. Swanson or Dr. Tolbert, would y'all like to add anything to that question?
I would like to add. So for a person who says that it decreases accountability, the question that I would have for that individual is, why are students in school in the first place? They're there to learn. And so when we take them out of the learning environment, then they don't have an opportunity to learn. So restorative practices will give the students and the teachers and the administration and the parents an opportunity for the student to stay where they're supposed to be and to identify those supports that will help them to stay where they're supposed to be, which is in the classroom, to get the instruction that they need.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swanson. And Dr. Tolbert, would you like to add?
I would just add that restorative practices, to me, is accountability. It takes a lot to sit in a circle and have a conversation with people that I've caused harm to, but it also takes even more for the person that's receiving or that has received the harm to be able to hear me out and better understand why I did what I did, but then to walk away with an agreement sometimes is even, to me, is even more important, because now I have the accountability to fix what I have wronged, and that outweighs sometimes the harm that was caused, depending on what that was. So I think it is a high level of accountability because you have to grow in that space that you caused the trouble in.
Thank you, Dr. Tolbert. So moving on we have about 3 more questions for anyone who's anxious to ask their own questions. We're getting to that place soon. For this next question, I want you all to maybe reflect, and we'll let every panelist answer if they'd like, or maybe just a couple to add to what they've already shared about some of the most meaningful benefits to restorative practices. And it sounds like a lot's already been said about the meaning of these practices, but would anybody on the panel like to add to what's been said from their personal experiences?
I'll go first. There was a study that an economist at Stanford University did, and I can't cite it exactly, it was several years ago, about what is one of the factors for student achievement. And of course we know, like, socioeconomics, things like that, opportunities, having opportunities and knowing about them. But one of them, the others, was not class size, not the education level of the instructor, but relationships. And I think that this is why this is so important, because it's building relationships And so that I think that when we talk about how is it going to help our community, how is it going to help outside of schools, and this idea of building a foundation, that the restorative circles are a foundation, but they're a foundation for relationships that I think, especially as we bring in the middle school students and they come into the high school knowing how to do the practice and knowing about restorative circles, that it's something that's going to help our school in other ways, not just school culture, but in school achievement too.
Thank you, Jody. Who would like to take this next, or who else has something to share?
I'll speak from a school administrative perspective. It builds community, and as the speaker before me just stated, it's all about relationships. But in that setting, having young adults come together and very well understand each other, things that are around them and how they impact who they are as people, that's powerful when they are expected to go into the community and be productive citizens. So to learn those practices and to know how to implement them and use them as people is more rewarding than, sometimes just sitting in the circle itself. So those are that is a major benefit that I've seen thus far.
Thank you, Dr. Tolbert. Anyone else?
And I was just hearkening to two quick things that I think I hate to use the word force, but it allows the opportunity to think about the why and the what next. Why did I do what I did, and why did you do what you did to me? But also then what's next? And I think that's the kind of the lazy part of us, it tends to be, is that we can quote the code word for word, but relationships are a little more complex. If I'm now forced to look at you as a person, all of us, and then decide what are we going to do now to move forward. And that's a more, again, complex decision. It makes us all start thinking again. We can respond emotionally, but when you get to the what's next and how we're going to restore this, almost, again, I use the word restoring a house. We know we want to keep the home, but we have to decide what goes and what comes, and what stays and what we discard. And I think that's the part that for me as administrator, I had to start thinking about. I had to, and then who's going to be involved in this process, and then monitor it. So.
Thank you, Javari. Anyone else? All right, so this next question, I think we've already touched some on this as well, some of these successes, but I do want to give our panelists an opportunity to share maybe a specific success story around implementing restorative practices. And we can start with Dr. Swanson.
Okay, thank you very much. So as a principal of a high school, we had this one student that I can think of who was coming in every day and disrupting the classroom environment. And the teacher could have written him up and sent him to the office, but she decided within her four walls to find out what was going on with the student. And so once she spoke with the student and told the student that I'm not going to allow you to behave in my classroom this way, so I'm going to give you some responsibility. And so she gave him the responsibility of being the greeter every morning. So he would come to the door, and he would come early because he wanted to make sure that he could fulfill the promise to her to be the greeter for that school year. And he welcomed the students in, welcomed the teachers in, and it built that relationship that we've been talking about in terms of him trusting the teacher and the teacher trusting him and giving him the opportunity to restore. And so that's one of the things that I can think of in terms of using those strategies to make sure that we listen and that we give individuals opportunities to do what they like doing, to bring them along, because again, it's about instruction and making sure that they're in the mindset to receive the instruction that's being taught.
Thank you, Dr. Swanson. Anyone else want to add to that? I think I had, Jody, if you had an example, I know you've already shared one of your student examples, but if you'd like to share another.
Well, I was still thinking about that student because I know that student's advisor, and just a few weeks ago, I had said to my colleague that what had happened with me and the student, and so the next time he saw her, he said, I am friends with Miss Vogler. She said, he didn't say anything like that we had conflict. He said, she's really proud of you that you're graduating this year. And he said that she looked down and she said, I wasn't very good in 9th grade. So I thought that I got a kick out of that. I thought it was kind of, that she had, reflected on what had gone on. So.
Thank you, Jody. Anybody else in the panel want to add a success story?
I actually used restorative practices today with the situation. A student was extremely upset with the teacher for a number of reasons, kept walking out, causing a disruption in the hallway, demanded to see me when I wasn't able to see her at that moment, but I stopped and went in and had a conversation with her. Later on today, I brought the teacher and the student together so that they can exchange stories. What happened? Why is it happening? When is it happening the most? But that student was able to communicate to the teacher exactly why she was behaving the way that she was behaving, and she shared from her heart. And the teacher was, at this point, had to face the student and then explain why she was responding the way that she was. But by the end of it all, they were able to leave the office shaking hands and hugging, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow, hoping that we don't have another walkout. But as for today, they were great, so that was a good way to end the day.
Thank you, Dr. Tolbert, for sharing that very recent success story. Anybody else before we move on?
I'll share one just because it was, so for me, this work is a lot about planting seeds, and I think as educators, that's our job, is to plant the seeds. And then I think like Jody, the seeds were planted and she didn't necessarily see the growth, but now she's seeing that, meeting that student. There was one example, I have lots of these kind of stories, but when I was an assistant principal, there were a few days where our Wi-Fi was not working and we couldn't figure it out. Our IT director couldn't figure it out. We called whatever our internet service provider came out, and all the work that was being done started to mount to a good bit of money of harm that of our internet being out. We shared a campus with an elementary school, so all their online interventions, everything, were disabled. And little by little, we isolated the problem to a student in the classroom had an app on his phone where he was able to knock out the Wi-Fi entirely. And so it took us probably 3 or 4 days, and so our approach was to deal with that restoratively. He was out of school for some days, but we ended up having a circle with about 15 people in there, including some students from the elementary school, the principal from the elementary school, the IT director, all kinds of people in that circle. And part of the plan for repair was that student who was on his way out, I mean, if we had chosen a path that led to him being out of school for a long time, he would have been dropped out. And then we've basically empowered somebody for the dark side of the internet, in a way. But rather than that, part of the plan was he took on the rest of that school year an internship with our IT director, which started with him sorting cables, telephone cables. He wasn't going to touch anything serious for a while. But he had an internship the rest of the year. That was his 10th grade year. He went on to his grades, started improving, graduated. He's gone on to college now. So, I mean, I just think that's one small example. There's so many that are possible like that when we choose this coming together type of way.
Thank you, Danny. And for our final question, I'm going to let Jabari start for this question. And this question is, with an eye for the future, how would you like to see restorative practices implemented in our community in Clark County or beyond?
Well, I certainly hope former teachers like myself, administrators, will be to answer this question. We've always heard kids say this, and I said it as well. When will I ever use this in the real world? Remember that math and all these things, and we were trying to get them to get enthralled in the process. Well, guess what? There's conflict all around us, especially when you leave our schools, whether it's at the end of the day or the end of your high school career, you're going to be in the real world. Well, here's a practical skill that we're able to give our kids who will become adults, who will live in every community, regardless of where it's going to be, with something that they can say, you know what, I'm going to use in the real world. because I'm always going to have an opportunity to engage and build relationships or tear relationships down. And that's the part that I would love to see community members, because everyone here listening and here in their physical presence will understand by the time we hit this traffic light and make a left, guess what? Someone's gonna have a response to our, whether it's gonna be road rage or whatever the case may be. It's the practicality of it, the practical application of relationship, hopefully building. And sometimes it's inadvertent, but still the opportunity to build it back.
Thank you, Jabari. Now, I'll open it up to the rest of our panelists, and then we'll be ready for our audience questions. So while we're waiting on our audience questions, I'm going to go back to that QR code. But any other panelists want to answer that question?
I'll respond. Recently, here in our city, we've experienced a lot of shootings, gang-related deaths, a lot of conflict that are actually spilling over into our schools. I would love to see where we're able to implement restorative practices within our communities, where our youth are able to deploy these strategies and use them instead of picking up guns and feeling like they need to fight each other, but being able to have conversations to diffuse the situations. Also, in the school setting, for restorative practices to not be just implemented by the adults. Again, it's a part of the culture. It should be anyway, embedded in the work that we're doing. So to have youth actually lead each other in these conversations and circles would be great, because now they have the skills in their hand that they're able to practice, and they are not waiting on us to say, okay, let's circle up and have this conversation. They can actually lead those conversations and then be, again, better productive citizens once they leave the schools.
Thank you, Dr. Tolbert. Anyone else before we go to the audience questions?
Yes, I would like to add, I think it would be beneficial for the restorative practices experts to provide training for counselors, school officials, so that we can train the students to be able to lead some of these restorative circles, and also get the training out to the community at large. Have families come in, family members, parents come in, and get this training as well, and then we can build it from there.
Thank you, Dr. Swanson.
I just want to add that at Clark Central, we have a freshman class of students who are becoming peer leaders in that respect. They meet it's an actual class every day, and I don't know the details of the class, but we are moving towards that, in that direction, to let we really want it to come from the students, right? Because they're the ones who are affected by it the most, like, can use it the most.
Thank you, Jody. Anybody else before we take audience questions?
Just want to second everything these folks have just said, especially this. So I was at Whit Davis today, and we were doing some training with some teachers around facilitating restorative processes. And that we started with this, everybody finished the sentence, conflict is like. And you just, I do this activity a lot, and any of us that grew up in our generations, we have conflict is like fire. Conflict is just very bad. None of us were taught about conflict growing up. And so I know for myself, I wanted to just stay far away from it. And so if we can teach our students that conflict is an opportunity, conflict is a chance to deepen your understanding of yourself and your classmates, I think we could go really have a lot of success in our community building those skills, like Jabari said. I think it's as basic as that, very practical skills for our students to be successful here and then wherever they're trying to go from here.
Thank you, Danny. So we have about 4 minutes for audience questions. I know that's not terribly long, but Karen Hope, our other trauma specialist in the district, is going to be passing the microphone around and then also asking any questions that were submitted online. So she's going to take over from the audience with her microphone.
Thank you. I guess I have one question. I'll ask it a little bit longer and then a shorter version. One, I generally like this, the restorative practices. I really don't like the response of, because that's the way we've always done it, because that doesn't seem to be working very well. So I like a new approach to this, and I like the examples that were given of success. I'm curious, and I don't know how long restorative practice has been around. Are there any long-term large studies that show the efficacy, or is there anything you can point to, studies that show, this citywide district turned violence incidents around by X%? Is there anything like that, or is it too new for that? And then I guess the short version is, does it work?
It looks like Danny would like to start this question.
There are some studies now, kind of empirical studies of this. It's not in U.S. schools. It's maybe 15 years or so, that maybe close to 20 in some places, that schools have been working on developing an approach to restorative praxis. There are some studies out there. Georgia Conflict Center's website, we have a lot of the research base and evidence base on there. A lot of them show not dramatic changes in the life cycle of the study, which is generally a year or 2 years. And for me, that speaks to, this is about culture change, and we're not going to change a culture that has been created over generations in 1 or 2 years. We have to have a longer term perspective and approach to that. But there are a few studies, but most of them don't show dramatic. They might show reduction in suspensions, reduction in disciplinary referrals. Those are some of the things that can be addressed more quickly, but the longer term impacts, the bigger impacts, the studies haven't shown in the short time frame of the study.
I would add to that, there are some studies that came out of Pittsburgh, and there are some schools that are in the New York area that have used restorative practices. It's not necessarily saying that they're the most effective, or it's the most effective way of handling conflict in those schools. However, they have implemented the practices, and they have seen some good outcomes from using them. But because it is so new, there's not a lot of studies that's being done on it. I would love to see Clark County implement it and actually be able to track the data to see how well it's implemented within our district and what changes it's making here.
All right, seems like the rest of our panel's pretty quiet, so I think that question's been answered, and it's right at 7, so I think we're gonna end here. Karen, were there questions online? Okay, good, because they were, maybe we would get some responses to y'all. But I want to thank everyone who came out in the rain, all of our parents in the audience, Dr. Phillips from the Department of Family and Community Engagement. I apologize for not introducing you sooner. And thank you to our wonderful panelists. Y'all have a safe trip home, and thank you again for coming.